Hi guys, today we'll delve into the case of a mother who was found on the kitchen floor in the middle of the night. The only witness was her own daughter. From the very beginning, there were many strange and chilling facts in the case, but detectives couldn't find the killer. It wasn't until many years later that the truth came to light in a completely unexpected way, catching everyone off guard. Crystal Perry was born on August 23, 1963, in the small American town of Rumford, Maine. She was the youngest of 10 children, and their parents had to provide for all of them, which was understandably a challenge. Crystal and her siblings grew up quite independently, with strict parents unable to watch over all the kids. Their older sister, who was just 12 when Crystal was born, took care of them like a mother, always looking out for her younger brothers and sisters. Growing up in such a tense environment, they all wanted to start their own separate lives as soon as possible, eventually scattering to different cities and states. Crystal was no exception. She wanted to start a family of her own and met a guy named Tom in high school. They soon got married and moved to California, but eventually, Crystal realized that big city life just wasn't for her. After a year and a half, they decided to return to Maine, settling in a small town called Bridgeton, about an hour away from her hometown. It was a quaint town, famous for being the setting of a Stephen King novel, The Mist. Crystal got a job at a local shoe shop, while Tom took on various odd jobs. Soon, Crystal discovered she was pregnant, and they welcomed their daughter, Sarah. Despite the fact that Tom had initially wanted to be a father, their relationship with Crystal became complicated after the daughter's birth. He spent more and more time at a local bar, squandering almost all their money on alcohol. Once, he even took the money Crystal had set aside for groceries. Since they didn't earn much, Tom's drinking habit sometimes left them with no money, even for food. At some point, Crystal decided to file for divorce. Tom continued to see his daughter from time to time, but wasn't actively involved in her life. The situation escalated when Tom got a new girlfriend who started to harass Crystal. She would call and threaten her, show up at her place, and cause scenes, all because she simply didn't like that Crystal and Tom had once been married. Crystal was afraid to let Sarah visit her father. She feared that his new girlfriend might actually harm her. Soon after divorce, Crystal moved in with her mother, and over the years, she worked hard to save up enough money to buy a house of her own. A few years later, she finally got the opportunity and purchased a small house on the outskirts of Bridgeton. It was located just a few dozen yards from a picturesque lake, surrounded by a forest. Crystal and Sarah were thrilled to have their own home just for the two of them. Crystal, who grew up surrounded by 9 siblings, made sure to give her only daughter as much attention and love as possible. After work, they always tried to spend time together, often renting a movie or just sitting and talking for hours. On May 10, 1994, when Crystal was 30 and Sarah was 12, they watched a solar eclipse together. The next day, as usual, Crystal went to work and Sarah to school. In the evening, they had dinner together, and Crystal tucked her daughter into bed. A few hours later, Sarah suddenly woke up to a loud scream. At first, she thought her mom was arguing with someone on the phone, but she quickly realized it was much more serious. Crystal was screaming at the top of her lungs, and Sarah immediately thought someone was attacking her mom. The door to her bedroom was slightly ajar, and through her fear, she came closer to it. Sarah realized that the screams were coming from the kitchen, but she couldn't see what was happening from where she stood. Sarah was gripped by fear and afraid to move or make any sound. After a few seconds, she heard footsteps and thought that whoever had attacked her mom was coming for her. She hid behind the bed, waiting for her door to swing open at any moment, but instead, she heard the kitchen drawer open, followed by a sound like someone was rummaging through the silverware. Crystal continued to scream and beg for mercy, and in the next few seconds, Sarah heard sounds as if someone had started stabbing her mom with a knife. With each new stab wound, her cries became increasingly muffled until they stopped completely. Despite being only 12, Sarah understood clearly that some unknown criminal was killing her mom. She wanted to rush to her mother's aid, but was paralyzed with fear. Sarah also realized that she had no chance against the knife-wielding person, and they would likely just kill her too. After her mother's screams stopped, Sarah couldn't move for several minutes. She waited for the criminal to come to her room, but the house was eerily silent. Gathering her courage, she finally left her room and headed to the kitchen, where she was met with a horrific scene. The lights were off, and only the moonlight illuminated the room through the window. As Sarah approached the kitchen, she glanced at the clock on the wall and saw it read exactly 1 a.m. On the kitchen floor, she saw her mother laying in a pool of blood. There was so much that it covered the entire floor. Despite being in a state of shock, Sarah understood that she needed to get help as quickly as possible. Next to her mother's hand, she saw the telephone receiver. She picked it up and dialed 911, but there was absolute silence on the line. Sarah then ran to Crystal's room, where the second phone was, and tried to call the police again. But this number also didn't work. She dialed the number several times, then realized she had only one option left: asking for help from the neighbors. Sarah rushed out into the street in just her pajamas, barefoot. It was May, and the temperature was quite low. It had also been raining that night, but she didn't think about anything except helping her mother. The closest house was around a half-mile down the road, towards the city center. She reached it and began knocking on the door, but no one opened. Sarah then ran to other houses, but again, no one answered. She kept running towards the city center, knocking on several more doors, but no one opened for her. Eventually, she reached an Italian restaurant where the owners lived in the attached building. This time, they finally opened the door. Sarah told them that someone had attacked her mom, and the shocked residents let her in. Sarah called 911 herself and reported what had happened. The officers immediately headed to their house. The first thing they noticed was the amount of blood. It was literally everywhere, on the floor, walls, and practically on every kitchen item. Crystal was dead, and the medical experts could tell at a glance that she had almost no chance of survival. Even if she had received help immediately after the attack, with such a blood loss, it would have been impossible to save her. On the front door glass, the police found a palm print, but quickly realized it likely belonged to Sarah. No other fingerprints were found at the crime scene, but there were numerous shoe prints on the kitchen floor, stained with blood. Investigators took photos to try to determine the size and model of the shoes, thinking they had most likely belonged to the killer. The prints also led towards Sarah's bedroom, but for some reason, the perpetrator turned back and didn't enter the room. Detectives also noticed a strange detail. Apparently, the killer tried to wipe away some of the blood from the floor. Considering that almost the entire kitchen was covered in it, along with Crystal herself, this seemed odd. It was obvious he couldn't have wiped away all the blood. Then, detectives noticed that some blood drops on the floor were in different shapes. Most of them looked as if they had landed at an angle. According to investigators, they had likely flown off the knife the perpetrator used to attack the victim. But there were also other drops that had fallen on the floor at a right angle, and judging by the splatters, from a greater height. Detectives speculated that apparently the perpetrator had injured themselves during the murder, and this blood belonged to them. Another confirmation of this theory was the fact that these drops led to a roll of paper towels, and there were none left on the way out of the house. Most likely, the killer used these towels to stop the bleeding and immediately left the crime scene. Medical experts found over 50 stab wounds on Crystal's body. The murder weapon was not found in the house, leading detectives to believe that the perpetrator took it with them. Experts only confirmed that it must have been a kitchen knife. The killer struck with such force that a piece broke off and lodged into the victim's body. Crystal also had been sexually assaulted, and experts were able to extract a sample of the perpetrator's semen. Along with the blood drops, it was sent to the lab. However, there was a problem. Due to funding shortages, the local laboratory was quite overloaded, so results would take at least 6 months. As a result, detectives had to begin the investigation without any evidence. First, they ruled out robbery, since nothing was missing from the house. There were no signs of forced entry either, leading police to speculate that the victim had opened the door to the perpetrator herself. Considering she was in her pajamas, she was unlikely expecting guests. Investigators theorized that she either knew the killer or someone unfamiliar knocked on the door and convinced her to let them in under some pretext. The detectives decided to start with the only witness, Sarah. They went to the hospital where she was being held for health checks and began questioning her. The police asked why she ran to the neighbors instead of calling 911 from her home. Sarah replied that both their phones weren't working, but this answer seemed strange to the investigators. When they arrived at the crime scene, they checked both phones and were able to make calls without any problems. The detectives assumed that in such a stressful situation, Sarah could have simply gotten confused. The receiver of the first phone was off the hook, and to make a call, it needed to be placed back. As for the second phone, they didn't rule out that Sarah might have dialed the wrong number in haste, or the phone line might have temporarily gone out due to the rain. Then the police began asking her if she saw the killer. Sarah replied that she hadn't left her bedroom until it was all over, but the police treated her story with slight skepticism. They asked how she could know that her mom was attacked with a knife. Sarah answered that it was obvious, but the detectives continued to press her. They felt that she might be withholding some information and that she had actually seen the perpetrator. In the first 3 days after the murder, the police interrogated Sarah 18 times, hoping that her story would change, but she continued to insist that everything had happened as she told them. While pursuing other leads, detectives stumbled upon their first breakthrough. They found a pair of boots at a local shoe store whose sole patterns matched the bloody footprints on the floor. They also discovered that Crystal had been harassed by Teresa, the girlfriend of her ex-husband. Despite the killer being obviously a man, the police decided to investigate her. Considering that Teresa had repeatedly threatened the victim with murder, she could have found an accomplice and convinced him to commit the crime. However, detectives found no evidence to support this theory. Investigators then learned that at the time of her death, Crystal was seeing a man named Dennis. They met 2 years prior when he started working in the shoe shop. They began dating shortly after, and Dennis eventually proposed to her. Although Crystal agreed, they never got married. Detectives found out that their relationship was quite tense. Crystal and Dennis argued a lot, and sometimes he displayed aggressive behavior. He could break things, hit the wall, and so on, but the police couldn't find any evidence that he had ever raised a hand on Crystal. The next day after the murder, they went to his house. When he opened the door, investigators asked if he had left his house that night or seen Crystal. Dennis immediately asked if she was dead, and in the next second, he collapsed on the floor. When he regained consciousness, he began answering the detectives' questions. Dennis confirmed that he had indeed planned to visit Crystal that evening, but got delayed after work, helping a friend fix a car. Upon returning home, he called Crystal, but she said it was too late, leading to an argument, and Dennis ended up staying home. While the police couldn't be 100% sure he was telling the truth, they were able to verify that he did help his friend that evening. Dennis also agreed to a polygraph test. The operator didn't detect any signals of lying except for one, when he asked if he felt responsible for Crystal's death. Dennis answered, no. Detectives also noticed that he had the same shoe size as the killer, but they found no matching footwear in Dennis's house. He agreed to provide a DNA sample, but made a strange request. He asked the detectives to do him a favor, and if they decided to arrest him, he asked them to come to his workplace through the back door to avoid disturbing others. He explained that his boss had always treated him well, and he didn't want to disrupt the workflow. Considering that he continued to insist on his innocence, this request seemed suspicious. Soon, the police found out something else. They had contacted Crystal's best friend, who lived in another town. She told them that just a few weeks before, Crystal had called her and said that she was scared of Dennis. Their arguments were becoming increasingly tense, and Dennis was growing more aggressive with each altercation. Crystal even thought about breaking up with him, but feared his reaction. Detectives also spoke with Crystal's colleague. During the conversation, she didn't provide any useful information. But as soon as the police left her workplace, Dennis came in and started asking what she had told the detectives. Despite their efforts, there was no evidence against the man, and the DNA test results would take months. So, the police continued to search for any other leads. They soon received a weird tip. A local man named Donnie got drunk at a party and started bragging about killing Crystal. They brought him in for questioning, but he claimed to have no memory of the party and denied any involvement in the murder. Investigators later found out that Donnie was an alcoholic and a known liar. Another witness reported seeing a black pickup truck with New Hampshire plates parked near Crystal's house, but this lead didn't lead anywhere either. One woman told the police that on the night of the murder, she was driving past Sarah's house when she heard sirens and thought they were for her boyfriend, who lived down the road and often got in trouble. At the same time, she saw a car with high beams on, following her at high speed. Thinking the driver was chasing her, she turned onto another road, but the car passed her by. However, the police couldn't confirm if this car was somehow related to the murder. Since then, the police struggled to find any solid leads. Crystal's relatives pulled together $10,000 as a reward for any information on the case. They also distributed flyers around town, hoping to attract new witnesses. It's worth mentioning that Teresa, the girlfriend of Crystal's ex-husband, was seen tearing down these flyers multiple times. As for the ex-husband himself, he was thoroughly investigated, but detectives eventually doubted his involvement. Over the years, his alcohol problems became even worse, and now Tom drank heavily every day. In his condition, it seemed unlikely he could have committed such a crime, and he had no clear motive. The police also looked into 2 other men Crystal dated after divorcing her husband, but they found no evidence linking them to the crime either. All of them, including Tom, provided DNA samples, leaving detectives waiting for the lab results. 9 months after the murder, investigators finally received the results, which showed that the blood and semen samples didn't match any of the suspects, including Dennis. This left detectives with no other leads. They requested Dennis's sample again for additional testing, but the results remained the same. Stuck in a dead end, investigators decided to revisit their only witness, Sarah. They still assumed that either she was lying to them or her mind had blocked out the horrific memories of her mother's murder, and she actually saw the killer. At that time, Sarah was living with her aunt in Texas, so the police headed to the other end of the country to question her. They polygraphed her, but the operator didn't detect any false answers. Despite this, investigators continued talking to her day after day, asking the same questions, but each time she replied that she didn't see the killer. After that, the case remained unsolved for several years. The police kept interviewing people, checking various suspects, but it yielded no results. In the late 90s, when the FBI DNA database became available, investigators uploaded the sample of Crystal's killer, but no matches were found. In 1999, a new detective was assigned to the case. He decided not only to review all existing evidence, but also to collect DNA samples from as many men as possible living in the town and nearby areas. By then, the laboratory could conduct tests much faster, and the police obtained hundreds of samples, but none of them matched. The new detective also reached out to Sarah and persuaded her to work with a psychologist to try to recover suppressed memories. She agreed, but the psychologist concluded that Sarah truly didn't remember anything and was telling the truth about not seeing the perpetrator. Since then, the case remained unsolved for many years. Detectives kept working on it, but couldn't find any new leads. This continued until 2006, when something unexpected happened. Detectives received a message. A DNA sample was entered into the FBI database, and it matched with the blood and semen left by Crystal's killer. The owner of the DNA turned out to be a man named Michael Hutchinson, who had never been a suspect in the case. Detectives found out that in 2003, he was arrested for assault and threats with a weapon, resulting in a 6-month prison sentence and 3 years of probation. At the time, his DNA sample was taken, but for some reason, it wasn't uploaded to the FBI database and remained stored in the lab. 3 years later, Michael was arrested for drunk driving with his children in the car. He was released on bail, but he didn't show up for his court hearing, so he was sent to prison. Michael was arrested right at his own wedding and placed in a cell. His DNA sample was taken again, and this time they immediately uploaded it to the database. Soon after, investigators in Crystal's case received a match. The detective called Sarah and informed her about this, but asked her to keep this information in secret until the official charges were filed. He also asked if she knew this person, and Sarah said no. Considering that Michael was already behind bars, the detective began slowly building the case to ensure that the suspect had no chance of escaping punishment. He found out that at the time of the murder, Michael lived in Bridgeton, just 2 miles from Crystal's house. Michael, who was 19 at the time, lived near the Italian restaurant where Sarah called the police. He drove to his mother's house almost every day, which was just a little further away than Crystal's house, so Michael regularly passed by it. For the detective, It meant that he could have seen Crystal multiple times. Eventually, he went to see Michael in prison, but the man claimed to have no connection to the murder, and he said he never knew the victim. Considering that his semen was found on her body and his blood found at the crime scene, the detective didn't rush to believe him. While in prison, the detective noticed something interesting. Michael had a large scar on his palm, and as we recall, Crystal's killer likely cut his hand during the murder. Although in court this could not be considered as strong evidence, the presence of DNA was more than sufficient, so Michael was finally charged with murder. According to the prosecution, the man, a known user of illegal substances, had repeatedly seen Crystal as he passed by her house. On that fateful night, he decided to assault her. Considering that he refused to confess, it was difficult to speculate on how exactly everything happened. But with the available evidence, the outcome was clear. Michael assaulted and killed her. During the trial, an explanation was also found for the fact that the killer managed to not leave a single fingerprint at the crime scene. And the answer was quite unexpected. Michael worked as a bricklayer. Over time, people who have been engaged in this job begin to wear away the patterns on their palms, making it physically impossible for them to leave fingerprints on various surfaces. In his defense, Michael told his version of events. He said he met Crystal at a bar, and they went back to her place where they had consensual intercourse. At some point, an unknown man in a black motorcycle jacket burst into the house, knocked Michael out, and killed Crystal. When he regained consciousness, Michael tried to fight off the attacker, but the assailant injured him in the hand and fled. Michael himself also decided to leave the crime scene without any reasonable explanation. His story obviously seemed highly doubtful. The only shoe prints on the floor also belonged to him. If his story was true, the intruder would have had to take off his shoes before breaking into the house, and it still wouldn't explain the absence of any other marks on the floor. Furthermore, there wasn't a single witness who saw Crystal at that bar. The trial ended on April 9, 2007, and Michael was unanimously found guilty. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole and remains in prison to this day. As for Sarah, her mother's murder undoubtedly had a critical impact on her. However, over the years, she found the strength to move forward. She attended college, became a writer, and published a book about her mother's murder, compiling all the available information. Moreover, when she was working on the book, Sarah managed to uncover new facts overlooked by the police. She discovered that during those years, Michael often borrowed his father's car, a black Ford pickup truck with New Hampshire license plates. As we recall, one witness reported seeing such a vehicle near Crystal's house. She also remembered the woman who told the police about the car with its high beams on speeding past her on the night of the murder. At the time, the woman mentioned she mistook the ambulance sirens for police's and thought they were heading to her boyfriend's house. That boyfriend was Michael. The police put his name and address in the report. However, back then, they decided there was no connection and didn't bother to investigate him further. Perhaps if the police had decided to speak with him, they would have noticed the cut on his hand, and the case would have been solved much sooner. But the past cannot be changed. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.